Justice Program. So for this talk today, we'll request everyone to please keep yourself on mute to avoid any disturbance. And we will first let Kanchi ma'am and Manju ma'am speak until around 4:30, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Please feel free to write any questions you have in the chat box, and I'll read them out around 4:30, if that works for everyone. Thank you so much, and now I'm glad to give the floor to Manju ma'am and Kanchi
ma'am. Thank you. It's a great, I can't even say actually, it's a great pleasure to be here and talking to a screen, though. It would have been great to have this conversation face to face, sitting around in a room or in a park over some chai, and it would have been great. But this is where we are, and thank God for technology that we are able to have this conversation. I'll just, what I'll try and do is just share a few thoughts, ideas, based on some of the discussions and the work that Manju and I have been having. A lot of it, what we've learned from the work, the people we work with, all of people like all of you who we interact with, and just as people who live in this world at this point of time. So I think a lot of what we'll be talking about really draws and comes from there. So just to start, I think there are few words that have become very common these days for all of us, and I think that's one of the reasons we are here. Air quality. I mean, almost everybody's checking AQI these days. Pollution, tree cutting, river water contamination, groundwater depletion, wildlife deaths, wildlife kills, climate variations, disasters, floods, earthquakes, and now very dominantly disease. So I think given that this is the context, for many of us who are here, and I think all of us, the thing is, the environmental crisis is real, and it's everywhere. So it's not really localized. It's not in one place. It's real and it's everywhere. But I think much as it's all spread out, it also means that it manifests itself through a whole bunch of different kinds of conflicts, and results in a whole variety of impacts that we're talking about. And these kinds of conflicts and variety of impacts you could see in at different scales. So, at one level we talk about at the planetary scale. So at a global scale, the words like when we talk about climate change, we talk about carbon footprint, we talk about fires in the forest in one country causing haze in another country. We're talking about changing weather patterns. We're talking about sea erosion and all those kinds of, where island countries are really talking about the impacts of climate change at that level. But that is global. These conflicts play out very differently at the local level, and that local level is basically where you have village communities talking about protecting fishing harbors, pastoralists talking about access to grazing areas, forest and agriculture based livelihoods. And all of these are very deeply intertwined, have a great deep relationship with the environment that people are living in, the forests, the farms, the coasts, all of that. So that is what we're talking about at scale. Then what we're saying is the conflicts also play out in different geographies. So you have, it's not very far away. So it's right here in urban areas. You have, all kinds of linear and area-based infrastructure that is really causing a whole bunch of conflicts. So, you have, which we are all familiar with, the fights to protect trees, parks, open spaces, rivers, has really exponentially grown in the last few years. Protecting bird and wetland habitats. So what does this mean? In Mumbai, it is the whole campaign for against the coastal road construction, or in Delhi, it will be the whole campaign and all that happened even about 10 years back when the Commonwealth Games village was being built on the river Yamuna. Or for that matter, it's the steel flyover in Bangalore. So these are the urban kind of conflicts that one is talking about. Uh, in rural areas, this means, and these kinds of conflicts play up very differently. So it's like diverting river water that is otherwise used for agriculture or drinking water purposes for industries or mines, blocked access for grazing lands or fishing lands, pollution because of a breach in a fly ash dike, which we saw recently in a place like Singrauli, directly impacting people's homes, agricultural fields, common areas, all of it. So, this means, like, when you hear of things like tribal communities trying to come together to save Hasdevarand forest in central India, saving fishing harbors in Karnataka against the expansion of the Karwar port. More recently, the felling of several trees and all other wildlife habitat loss in Arunachal Pradesh because of the construction of a hydropower dam. The over a lakh trees being felled, in Talavera forests in Orissa. So the whole bunch of things that happen, they cut across geographies, you know, and it's not, in many places, it's not even distinctly urban or rural. What we're talking about is many mixed geography areas. So the Save RA movement actually in Mumbai brings together urban and rural together. I mean, it's not just very distinctly what you recognize as a city or what you recognize as a forest. These are also spaces that interact with each other much more deeply. So these conflicts are playing up in a very different way in different places. It also cuts across different ecosystems. So it's not just limited to forests or in inviolate wild spaces that we're talking about. So it's not just about an interlinking river project impacting tiger habitat, or a railway cutting through a dense forest area impacting elephant habitat. It's not just those flagship species and wild areas that we're talking about. We're also talking about the whole bunch of issues that come up in agrobiodiverse or cultivated areas, where we don't even know the that 30 crops are actually grown on a 1 acre farm, or for that matter, there are 200 varieties of the rajma beans that we might have never eaten. And how are they are the kinds of impacts that take place on these kinds of on this kind of biodiversity and livelihoods when land use change takes place, or a corporation wants to commercialize some of these species. So there are all kinds of conflicts that are coming up in these areas. So at scale, at different geographies, and in different ecosystems. Now, this kind of gives a sense that the problem that we are dealing with is enormous, it's complex, and it, in many ways, if you keep that in mind to really understand how has this problem really been responded to by governments or by policy. And one of the first ways, in many ways, it's responded to by saying economic growth will fix it. So there's a very popular curve that is used, a diagram that is used called the Kuznets curve, which basically was used for poverty alleviation at this one point of time, where it said that as per capita income will increase, poverty will also increase. But when we have enough money in our hands, we can use that money to solve the poverty crisis. So at some point of time, that curve goes up and it comes down. Now, the same Kuznets curve was actually, for a while, we've tried to apply it to addressing environmental problems. So all the conflicts that I was talking to you about, as per capita income will increase, as a country's economic growth increases and wealth increases, environmental degradation, livelihood problems will increase. And when we have enough money in our hands, we'll use that to solve the environmental crisis. Now, there are two problems that arise with something like this, in this sort of a fix, which is basically you don't know at what point of time that curve will tilt. So at what point does it go straight up and then come down? And even if it does, a lot of the environment and the livelihoods are already destroyed. So this curve, this Kuznets curve, which has been applied for to justify that economic growth is a priority and environment would be the trade-off, is an important one to understand, to figure out why is it that we have uh, a kind of understanding of the problem and the kinds of solutions that are coming up. So I think if you see the four kinds of solutions that have almost like come up, and there would be many more, but pretty much four kinds of solutions that come up to address the problem of environmental crisis, in many ways to fix the crisis. And this is not to say that these are not important, or these are not adequate, these are not necessary to be able to be part of the package to address the problem, but it's important to understand that these are fixes, or these are solutions which frame the problem in a certain way, uh, because so there are certain solutions to offer already, and because those solutions are on the table, you frame the problems to be able to fit those solutions. So with that is with that as the entry point, and also often it is used to distract and divert our attention from addressing and acknowledging the root causes of a problem. So what could be, so as I said, these are all important things that you hear about, but they become solutions in themselves often. So what are the four kinds of solutions that you see? Number one is doing long-term studies to understand what the environmental impacts are going to be. So how do they manifest themselves? For instance, there's a very classic example of a power plant being built in the coast of Maharashtra, where when the power plant was being built, farmers in Alfonso mango farmers in that area basically said that construction of a power plant is going to impact the Alfonso mangoes. So when this issue came up, the decision-making authorities said that for the next 3 years, while the power plant is being built, let us actually continue to assess whether there is an impact on the power plants or not. So the power plant also got built, and the assessment also came, and eventually the assessment said that well, there are no major impacts of the power plant on the mangoes. So it really didn't become part of the long-term assessments, which are important to do as baselines and to be able to as a precautionary measure, then became and almost like a post facto assessment that let's go on business as usual, but we will try and assess what the impact is as we going on. The second kind of solutions that we often we see coming from policies as well as the government is technology, and we are here because of technology, but uh, a lot of the technology responds to things like what you see is there's an air pollution problem in Delhi, so let's get smog towers to address that problem. Or there's a lot of pollution in rivers in a industrial estate, so let's just do online monitoring of how the water quality works. So we'll use technology to understand what the problem is, and that will help us fix it at some point of time. So just because industries will be reporting the amount of emissions or effluent, you will be able to the problem will be addressed. Or for that matter, uh, it's okay to fell 14,000 trees, but because we are building an energy efficient building. So I think these are the kinds of solutions that are coming our way. The third kinds of solutions that are coming up increasingly is our offsets. So for instance, uh, compensatory plantations for forest diversions and tree felling. These are it's so for instance, there was a news item about 2.7 lakh trees in Arunachal Pradesh that are going to be cut. They will be cut along with a compensation package of X number of trees that will be planted somewhere else, which is part of those documents as well. It's okay to access local knowledge related to seeds or local knowledge related to a particular fruit, which are it's very localized, as long as you can do an agreement and do a recognition and use it to pick that up and actually be able to sell a produce somewhere else. Um, uh, and the fourth kind of solution that is often offered is that of valuation. So basically, you put a price on a natural resource because that's how you're looking at it. So you pay X amount for the water use, you pay X amount for forests, you pay X amount for land, and you can pay and use, or you can actually pollute and pay. So a lot of the fines and damages that come up, it's okay, fine, you've done it. You can carry on your all the industrial and infrastructure activities as long as you pay for the damages. So this is becoming actually almost routinized and as part of the response to this. But what is completely missing here is even in the nature of impacts is the issue of health, and in particular, and more particularly, public health. And for the longest, if you people have been raising this, and for the longest, uh, public health and environment have just not been seen together in the same policy space. So, and even in these solutions, you don't see public health and environment in the same policy space. And uh, what how this really it can be seen is that, for instance, when you do impact assessments or you look at environment regulation, you do not have health studies really part of they're not normalized. So even if how good or bad the assessments would be or the studies would be in as part which are mandatory in environment regulation, the health component is not really central to it. um, at project level, when you raise issues about there is a health impact of a flyover being constructed, or health impacts of in Delhi, attribution becomes a big problem. So who is responsible for the health impacts in a particular area, in a city or in a localized village or anybody else? Proving that attribution becomes a big problem. In policy documents, regulators have said it's too complex to calculate. So in 2016, there was in all across the country there are critically polluted areas that are recognized, and where special kind of safeguard measures have to be taken. But in these areas, one of the criteria to figure out whether a place is critically polluted, till recently 2015 2016, health was an important indicator. And 2016, actually, that indicator was removed because it was too complex to even calculate what the health impacts of this environmental degradation would be. Um, Another thing that comes up when we talk about looking at health, and more particularly public health and environment, is that food security, which you get from forests, farms, which is important for nutrition, health, all of those aspects, is neither seen as an environmental issue, nor is it seen as a public health issue. So it becomes like the domain of agriculture and farming. It's in our framing, we don't talk about food security and nutrition as an environmental or a public health issue. And finally, of course, in the most vulnerable and environmentally compromised areas, the public health infrastructure is extremely weak. And you see places which in Orissa or in Chhattisgarh or many other areas which are highly industrialized, or where there are several mines operating in the same space, you see public health infrastructure is extremely weak. It's weak in many parts of the country, but here where the environment is extremely compromised, and the place is already vulnerable. The impacts of a weak public infrastructure are much more deeper. So then today, when we are in a pandemic like situation, it becomes critical to talk about environment and health together, and that's why we also thought of a topic like this. Because environment is a concern, public health is a concern. Why is it more and more important to bring this together, these two together? It's also important to bring this together because we're talking about increased vulnerability in both urban and rural areas. Um, there's already existing writing and people are talking about it, that air pollution impacts could actually increase the risk uh, to health in a pandemic like situation. We're talking about washing hands all the time, and there are places where water is extremely polluted or there is no access to water. These are all both public health problems as well. um, it's also important to talk about both of these together because we are in a situation where um, the pandemic is also being dealt with prioritizing what is essential and what is not. So you see certain kinds of local economies, local livelihoods, which are not on the priority list. So you are talking about, when I spoke about earlier about, economic growth will fix everything. So priority is for constructing highways. You would try and, open up mining areas. You would allow for certain kinds of industries with standard operating procedure to be operating. However, uh, farmers, people who collect forest produce, people who fish, those value chains, those systems are still not on the essential list. So they've come in now, through people actually petitioning and writing, but it's still not as essential as opening up other mainstream economic sectors. And these other sectors that we're talking about are deep linked to those to the idea of food security and health that we were talking about earlier. In many parts of the country where these essential services have opened up, where these environment was already extremely compromised, which I was talking about several mining areas, say for instance a place like Keonjhar in Odisha, where you would have increased number of trucks moving material. There's a lot of dust everywhere, but in the essential service list, or you don't have functional institutions to really respond to that. So you don't have functional institutions for both public health delivery in these places because the public health infrastructure is weak, and you don't have functional institutions to address the environmental crisis in these places. So your already existing compromise and vulnerable space becomes even more problematic in a situation like this. And that's why it's important to bring these two aspects together. And in cities, so many places, not just in cities and even in other areas, where you can see visible change in environmental parameters. We are all clicking pictures of blue skies. We are enjoying the fact that rivers are running clean. One of our colleagues that even who works in an extremely polluted area in Gujarat sent a photograph of a river which uh, which I think people had refused to buy fish from that area because the water was so polluted. But in the 21st phase of the lockdown, that place had completely transformed, and so they were so these visible changes of environmental parameters, when certain activities are not coming to bear on those areas, is very visible. And you can see people's psychological and also personal responses to these kinds of places. So, I mean, I'll just end by just saying that I think, and that what Manju and I were also discussing, is that in many ways, both public health and what this moment is getting much more we're getting to realize it much more in this moment. Of course, drawing from a lot of work that people have done in the past as well, is that uh, in many ways, both public health and environment are part of a larger commons. Uh, they're both everyone's crisis and no one's problem. And that we can talk about now or subsequently. That is what needs to change. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manju ma'am, for sharing your thoughts on. Sorry, Kanchi ma'am, for sharing your thoughts on this. Manju ma'am, if you want to also share your comments for maybe about 15 minutes, and we can open the floor for questions at 4:45 because I don't see too many coming in yet.
Yeah, yeah. I don't have too many things to to add to what Kanchi said, but I just wanted to also bring in the context of what we're dealing with right now, um, with respect to, you know, how governments are responding to this pandemic, as well as the state of the economy across the world. And one of the things, I mean, I think that Kanchi pointed out, which actually is so critical to, it was such a revelation for those who still didn't understand what our national economies or what the global economy is dependent on. It became very clear in the first few days itself about how intensely dependent the global economy is on extractive industries, on projects that are extremely degrading to the environment, to lands of indigenous people, and all of that stuff. I mean, it became quite obvious that the things that are essential to the economy, not necessarily to human survival, the things that are essential to the economy are the projects and sectors which are most degrading and harmful, and the very sort of sectors that the people working on climate change and climate justice are up against. So it's a huge challenge, which is extremely difficult to overcome, because these are precisely the aspects that need to be changed, and these are precisely the sectors that the economy is so fully in control. I mean, that the economy so fully depends on. That was the first point. The so almost as an immediate reaction to how the economy sort of has taken a sort of a big shot because of the pandemic. We've seen across the world, right from countries like the US to places like India, irrespective of where you are on the economic development spectrum, there are massive rollbacks being proposed of environmental laws and policies, things that, laws and policies that have taken 20, 30, 40 years to actually sort of bring into enforcement, and which are still sort of fraught with all kinds of challenges. These are precisely the kinds of legislations and policies that countries are trying to roll back right now in the name of reviving the economy, reviving national economies. And it's going to be, it's going to be a pretty uphill task to actually try and see how much of that is actually needed, or how these rollbacks actually impact various aspects that Kanchi has spoken about, both in terms of public health and climate change. And the third aspect is the precise reason why this should be something that is of concern to everyone, irrespective of whether they see themselves as environmentalists or not, or they see themselves as activists or not. The one thing that matters the most is that very valuable taxpayers' money, which is meant to go into the right kinds of things, like protecting public health and improving our performance in response to climate change. This is precisely the money that's going to go into bailing out these sectors that are seen as most important for the economy. So I think these three aspects, I just wanted to bring in these three aspects so that we are not losing, so that we can bring the economic arguments into this whole discussion, because it seems like, a whole lot of, I'm just taking what Kanchi said seriously, which is, why should we be talking about these things at this particular point? And one of the most important things that's happening at this particular point is the responses of national and global, forces to this pandemic, and what the economic fallout of this pandemic will be. And it would be a terrible, terrible tragedy if we just went into this in the most unreflexive way, without looking at how much of these changes that we're proposing is actually going to help us in the future to deal with climate change or future public health crises. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. I think it was so helpful how you have linked, Kanchi ma'am has linked different issues related to public health and economy to the solutions we pose for climate crisis. And Manju, thank you so much for bringing it back to how we kind of need to think of alternatives in this situation, which brings me to some of the questions that we have. So from Chittube, we have any example or experiment from India which should be a role model to be considered for other states when it comes to environment, public health, and economic development? This project should have shown constructive results in India on the ground.
Kanchi, you want to take that?
So I missed the second part. Basically, an example of I was just writing it down. You can just repeat that for me. Yeah.
They're listed here on the side.
It's a question from my side, Kanji. So what I want to say, like, is there any experiment which have been done by any state government, a local body, or by the national level government, which has given some positive results on the ground concerning environment, public health, and economic development? So that's it. Thanks.
And I'd also just add, we can maybe club this with Alankrita's question, which is, could you talk about some alternative approaches that have been successful against the Kuznets curve approach in developing country context?
I mean, there are a lot of there have been a lot of I think not experiments, but I think lived experiments. I think, and they are quite alive right now, which do give very important principles in which can be brought on board to address these problems. For instance, for the longest time, in a bunch of Dalit women farmers in southern India, part of the Deccan Development Society, have been talking about local production, local consumption, and local distribution to address, and basically what they're talking about is biodiverse farming on small acres. So it addresses multiple sets of issues. It responds to the a crisis of, say, water, pesticides, marginalization that has been created because of irrigated agriculture. It also talks about the kind of food that we eat. It also talks about reducing the environmental footprint because of transportation of food from one part of the country to another part of the country. So there are very important principles in an experiment like this. There have been also lots of I'm not aware, and maybe Manju, I don't know if you want to add something about which state governments have really taken on board. Some of the more recent experiments on urban mobility, etc., that we're talking about, those are where state governments have come in. But I'm not sure if any state government has comprehensively really brought public health and environment together. But there are definitely these principles of these localized principles, experiments that have that for not now, actually for a very long time, that have been talking about linking nutrition, health, environment in these places. But upscaling those is definitely a challenge.
Yeah, I just want to add about this on the question of alternatives. So there's lots of groups who are sort of experimenting at very micro levels about how things can be done differently, and these are mostly sort of centered around livelihood groups. So groups of communities who are doing who have a particular relationship to the environment or to natural resources, and so building sort of all the different aspects of social life around around that particular relationship that this livelihood group has with natural resources. There are very many interesting experiments, and there's a lot of writing on it as well. But one of the biggest problems with alternatives is that it needs policy space to thrive, and it needs acknowledgement, or it needs some form of acceptance from government in order to not be in order to not be trampled on. And that actually is one of the most difficult issues that most people face. So, there's a, while working in this field, there's a lot of discussion that goes on about individual behavior change, and what we can do as individuals to contribute to a better environment. And these days our government departments, especially our environment ministry, actually promotes a lot of that. But the unfortunate part is, and this is true as much of individual behavior change in urban areas as much as it is of rural areas, that you actually need space for these alternatives and different notions of how to live life. You need space by which you can practice it, and you can promote it, and you can get more and more people to become a part of that. So whether it is cycling groups in urban areas, or whether it is growing organic food, like Kanchi was just mentioning the example of the women at DBS. One of the biggest challenges was to try and ensure, so all the women grew traditional millets as food, because that's what is so productive in dryland areas. And one of their biggest challenges was to try and figure out how they could get governments to adopt millets into the public distribution system. And that piece of the work was actually such an important part of the work to ensure that this experiment actually thrived and could live, and could be practiced by many people.
Thank you so much. The next question from Mukund is, in the last 2 months, carbon emissions have reduced by 3 billion tons. How do we maintain these reduced emissions? And he also asked, how do we leverage the present action by most governments to precipitate unified action to address climate change?
The reason I asked this question is, for the first time in the last 30, 40 years of climate struggle, we have seen that there is a drop in carbon emissions, and not a wee bit, 3 billion tons. So instead of throwing out 40 billion tons every year into the atmosphere, this year we will be throwing 37 billion tons. Now this I see as a silver lining in the dark clouds of COVID. How the government action in this case precipitated into something so drastic that 7 IPCC reports and the COP21 agreement in Paris.
Mukund, sorry to interrupt, but I just want to give Kanchi.
We have not been able to achieve reduction. So my question is, let's make this momentum of reduced carbon emission, and that's what should be our primary goal, using this, leveraging this to ensure that we maintain that.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a silver lining, because it's come at a great cost to a lot of people. So I mean, I'm sitting here in Delhi, and Kanchi and I were just talking about it, that every time you look up, you look at the gray skies and feel really, I mean, you look at the blue skies. No, I can't even see blue skies. You look at the blue skies and feel really happy about it. And then if you pay attention to what's happening on the streets, the situation with the migrants and with workers who live hand to mouth is extremely depressing. So a lot depends on where you're looking. But I don't disagree with you at all that there's been a huge shift in in the environmental performance or just the environmental parameters around us. But this is not going to stay, isn't it? Because most economies are wanting to get back on their feet as soon as possible. In fact, there's a very tense conversation happening between state governments and central government about when this lockdown should be lifted and how soon and in what form. And this is not just about India. I think it's happening in the US in such a frightening way. So I feel that this is a very surreal and a very odd sort of experiment that we've all just observed. If we have enough number of people who realize that this is the level of sacrifice it is likely to take for us to turn things around, then we are going to have to plan for that, so that the costs of changing things around does not fall too heavily on particular groups of people or particular parts of society, like it has done, like this pandemic has done. It has definitely, it's particular groups of people that have borne the immense costs of what was necessary to do for public health. So, so I feel like, calling it a silver lining would be a little difficult, but I think it's given people a taste of what the levels of change we need to actually turn things around. And I don't know whether governments have that kind of appetite to accept this and build something sustainable from here. I hope they do, but it doesn't look like they do, because we can already see laws and policies kind of shifting in the wrong direction.
So the next question from Niket is, there has been a lot of articles about a new world order with regard to environment, social inequality, and such other issues during this pandemic. In what form do you think this pandemic would fasten such sort of transformation, if at all, related to your previous?
In many ways, I think what Manju was saying was this. I think there are different sorts of imaginations that are coming out of this whole discussion. I think some people are. There is an article about how Milan is actually planning carless streets, and there are protests saying, "I want industries to open." So I think there are places where we are actually looking up and being able to breathe in a place which is extremely toxic, and there are places which are turning extremely toxic as we speak. So I think those are both realities that we are talking about. And I think all the old problems about what you feel is the priority still exists. So what should take primacy, what is of more priority, which is what I was talking about. That's you can see that even as we are giving exemptions to specific sectors. So you can see financial packages coming for specific kinds of things, and specific kinds not coming for specific kinds of things. You can see value chain and markets opening up for specific kinds of commodities and not another kind of commodities. So while I think we are all here, and I think we would want this to really we'll have to this to really shift shift the momentum a little bit and not go as business as usual. But if you hear from states that have or countries which are already opening up, it's gone back to business as usual and worse. So in fact, it's the labor problem along with the environmental problem that has really grown in these places, which will have to be dealt with. And so definitely when we're bringing together environment and public health. So I think our struggle to be able to make the environment and the climate change sets of issues more mainstream and more dominant, I think has just begun. And it's just gotten, to be very honest, it's gotten much more difficult to some extent. What will really help us is this period as a very important baseline to say the world can look like this. one part of the world can look like this. So the other part is in a mess, but one part of the world can look like this if you are able to manage things a little better. So we definitely have this. Till now, I think we didn't even have that imagination, because many of us were, I think, born into a toxic dump. So I mean, we couldn't even imagine a place, in a different way. So I think these are these, but I do think we'll have to just draw upon the good experiments, the alternatives, all of that much more, and try and push for it much, in much more deeper ways, because yeah, I'm not, as Manju was saying, that it's you're hopeful but not entirely hopeful. It's like you want people to actually realize it, but I'm not sure that's happening, because come one day the lockdown lifted, everybody was likely to go back to their favorite things. That can happen as a reaction, and we have to be prepared for that.
I think another thing that has been demonstrated, in this period of lockdown, is that governments, the ability of governments to take very hard steps in public interest. I think that has actually kind of almost come as a very big surprise to a lot of people who believed that governments tend to be slow, they tend to prevaricate, and which has also happened in some contexts, this time. But a lot of governments have also taken very hard decisions and stayed with those hard decisions. That's on the one hand what this whole situation has demonstrated, and climate activists and environmental groups have been asking for this kind of this kind of commitment from governments to solve the climate problem. This is what they've been asking for. They've been saying, don't keep talking about it, don't keep asking the same questions over and over again, let's just do it. So that has been demonstrated in this case. But interestingly, what I think has also appeared so clearly in this context is how how governments, whether it's national governments or state governments, have struggled with a legitimacy problem. It's really been quite amazing to see how government communication takes very long to reach the ground. There are other kinds of communication that sort of cut the effectiveness of government communication. There's all kinds of problems going on. So, this has been an interesting situation for many of us to understand all the different pieces that need to be worked on if we want to actually move forward decisively to solve the climate and environmental problem. Like, for example, I think one of the interesting lessons for a lot of us has been how important it is to decentralize control. It's really important to do that, because decentralized units of governance, they know their people the most. And so they're able to put measures in place that are likely to work and which people are likely to accept as measures that are important for everyone's well-being. It's come out so clearly in so many cases in this context.
I just want to mention, so we have about 7 minutes left. Maybe we can go a few minutes after that, but not beyond. So I'm sorry if I don't get everyone's questions. So one question I think has been addressed from Chitra. She was asking about the role of local self-government, and you've mentioned decentralization. Then we have a question from Preeta. When dilution of environmental regulation are happening very drastically in India, and there is no enforcement, how do we bring health impact assessment, which becomes very crucial through this pandemic?
Okay.
Just ask and continue to ask, I suppose. I think the environmental regulation has been on the decline for a very long time. It was just that more recent, I think last year or this year before, they had made health impact assessment mandatory as part of environmental impact assessment. So after a lot of pushing, a lot of evidence that was collected from many of these places, this issue did become part of the environment regulation. So far, the dilutions have not rolled that back. So, so I think I'm going to just say we have to just hold on to those little successes that we've had, little hooks that we have still, and keep pushing. I mean, I think I don't think we have any other choice but to be able to organize and do that. And I think it's already happening. You can see a lot of message that is, whether it's through social media or other kinds of other forms, those messages are going to the government. We just have to amplify that much more. And I think it has to be deeply rooted in examples of from places. So I think we have to really root this from places, so that it's not just you and me talking about it. It's really a lived experience that you're bringing to the fore. Just like we're talking about a lot of the examples of alternatives coming out, and we're talking to influence policy, we're talking about a lot of local evidence of where either people have tried to address it, or people are actually affected because it is not addressed, to be able to argue that it needs to be addressed. So I think it's going to be a long haul, like many other things. But this is something we can do even sitting here. Actually reaching out to places and figuring out what's happening in those geographies, and pulling in those examples, and then influence the government that you have to address public health infrastructure along in environmentally compromised areas. You have to ensure that environmental institutions are effective. And only then we'll be able to even take baby steps towards addressing this issue.
Yeah, I think as Kanchi pointed out, initially, one of the biggest stumbling blocks that we ourselves, I think to some extent, our own environmental discourses in India have, and I'm saying this particularly about the Indian context because I'm most familiar with it. The way environmental narratives have evolved in India, even the best of us, we tend to think of the environment or ecological relationships, that is between human beings and nature, or whatever it is. We tend to see them as resources. So even though, I mean, all the activists, many of us activists, we may talk about it as livelihoods. So we're talking about it as local resources that are important for communities, but we don't necessarily think of it and speak about it like as if it is life-sustaining, it is nature that sustains life. So because of that, we also somehow invariably fall into the economizing trap, which is that we think about resources in economic terms, just like how the big economists think about environment in economic terms. But if we start thinking about it as resources that sustain life, or we think about it as an entity that sustains life, then I think our associations, or what we want to do with the natural environment and how we want to manage it, would actually be quite different from what we're doing with it right now. So I feel that, I mean, maybe after this whole experience, because a lot of people now are talking about how, human communities have become very extractive with nature, and that is why there are all these crazy things that are going on, and we're having so many virus attacks in such short time frames. Maybe our language of talking about why it is important to protect the environment might actually change to some extent, because it sustains life eventually.
Prerna had a question related to the Arunachal Pradesh project and how more clearances are being granted and how to address this. But I think your previous points will hopefully address her question. And there was a question, sorry, just give me a sec. From Ritika, how worrying do you think is the authoritarian nature of the decisions taken by the governments? Will they limit our ability to take organized action against the ill-advised decisions by governments?
Good question. Well, I think yes, but I guess that's always been an issue. I mean, every time activists have raised problematic, difficult, inconvenient questions, I think there has been, counteractions. So there's no reason to believe that it will not happen now. But I feel that as Fridays for Future or other groups who are working, young groups particularly who are working because this is the future of this generation that matters the most now, and the generations that are going to come. I think it's important to actually think about this question of organizing and mobilizing and how it can be done in these contexts, because organizing, I mean, we were just talking about this a while ago, that when Kanchi and I first started working in this field, the kinds of strategies and the ways in which we organized communities and the way in which we worked on in certain areas to deal with these issues, they're not the same anymore at all. So I feel that the question of organizing actually is a very, very important one, given how governments view organizing work, and given the different kinds of challenges as well as opportunities that things like technology offer. I think it's actually a very critical question, and we could do a long discussion on that at some point.
Okay, I'm just going to let this be the last question. I'm so sorry if I've missed anyone's question. But from Alankrita, could you talk about policy formation on the forest rights front and its effect on public health India? Is regulatory governance the only solution?
I mean, our existing forest rights framework actually allows for a huge amount of possibilities, including the possibilities of self-reliance that the Prime Minister spoke about today. I think to lots of the sarpanches, I think the thing is, when the forest rights framework talks about rights and recognition of rights, there is a lot of clarity. But when that same rights framework comes in the way of what we've been talking about, economic growth, that's when the conflict arises. So I think there are the forest rights framework and what has been thought of through that framework and how governance can happen. There's a lot to actually draw from there. There would be critiques, but there is talk about decentralized governance. There's talk about how deliberative decisions should be taken. There's talk about different kinds of rights to be recognized, both resource rights and non-resource rights. All those kinds of things are very much part of that framework. So I think we can draw a lot from it. But until till the time those dominant ideas of what can fix our problem is not addressed, even the good practice and the good principles in our existing laws and policies land up getting not prioritized or ignored or diluted, or all that we're talking about. And that's what the forest rights groups are talking about right now. They've been saying that the Prime Minister today spoke about things have been better in village areas and forest areas than they've been in urban areas. But we've had decentralized frameworks and forest rights frameworks that are operating even in urban areas. The RA movement actually showed that forest rights in an urban area are extremely important. So I think those things, we can really draw upon those things to really push the ideas that are there in these frameworks, and that these are not compromised in the light of a certain kind of economic decision that we need to take.
Thank you so much. So it's 5:03. So we'll just close now. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but I know we also all learned a lot from all your experiences and insight, and it just shows the depth of knowledge you have on these issues. And maybe if people have questions, you can direct them to Manju ma'am and Kanchi ma'am. Maybe you can write to us, and we'll share their emails with you. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to have you both. And I think we all need to take these conversations further and really think about and reflect on how we can incorporate these ideas into our movements. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for thinking of us.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.